So, this is Worth as a sexual violence advocacy practice and real programs. And this is our second webinar in the Fabric of Healing series. Welcome. So, here are our learning points for today. First, we're going to reflect on the importance of worth. Then, we're going to analyze the gaps between the availability of support to sexual violence survivors and survivors' needs. After that, we will evaluate how worth corresponds to our programming before wrapping up today with identifying practical skills and strategies for promoting worth. So let's briefly recap for what we've learned in the series so far for those who weren't able to join us for part one. We focus on healing centered advocacy because this is how we, as advocates, can best meet the self identified needs of sexual violence survivors. Again, those needs are to be believed, to have emotional support, and be able to achieve healing and safety. The other reasons we focus on healing centered advocacy is because it helps survivors navigate feelings of hopelessness, worthlessness, insecurity, and disconnectedness after sexual violence. Healing centered advocacy also can help us meet the needs of sexual violence survivors, regardless of their background or when the violence happened in their lives. And it looks like there might be a question. Because we're in webinar mode, I can't unmute you and let you ask the question yourself. But if you would like to, you could put the question in the Q&A box. Or if it's a more of a logistical question, you can send a message to Alex and she can help you then. And so if we're doing healing center advocacy that supports the needs of sexual violence survivors, then the role of the sexual violence advocate needs to also center that too. When we provide healing centered advocacy and frame our services under these concepts hope, worth, security, and connection it enables our services to meet the needs for survivors and help them eventually to thrive. But why is worth one of those frames that we focus on? To really answer that, we have to go back a couple of years. So if you all can indicate in the chat or use reactions or emojis, how many of you have heard of the Sexual Assault Demonstration Initiative? Or you might hear us refer to it as the SADI project. Okay, I'm seeing a couple of reactions. And some people are raising their hands in response to the question. I really appreciate your use of the Zoom interactions. I know we're in webinar mode, but it really helps us to be able to interact whatever way we can. So thanks, everybody. Great. Okay. For those of you who haven't heard of the SADI project, this was a 10-year project that focused on building the capacity of dual programs or dual or multi-service programs to support sexual violence survivors. And some of these programs were in rural areas. Now, as a result of that project and of that work, there was a report that came out, and there were 8 different lessons that came out of the project. And so these were big, major ideas. One of them was, and I'm going to read it to you all now strong programs embrace change and growth. Enhancing sexual assault services and dual and multi service programs requires that programs acknowledge that sexual violence survivors are not getting what they deserve. It requires openness to more radical changes than making tweaks to existing programs. Programs must bravely engage in an honest and critical self assessment that includes reflections on whether, as an organization, they are ready to say, we don't know what we don't know, and to accept feedback in all areas, including those where they thought they were doing well. And it's important to acknowledge, right, that for a 10-year capacity building and research project this was one of the major findings that came out of it. And again, this was from programs across the nation, large and small, urban and rural. But the conclusion was sexual violence survivors deserve better. And I think most of us can agree with that, right? Not just from our programs, right? So I'll be talking a lot about what our programs can do today, but in generally, sexual violence survivors deserve better. And this is part of why we do this work. Oh, okay. And so I also want to make sure, and I think our tech support already did. Thank you so much. You all know about the Elevate Uplift project. And so they are the ones, which is led by the Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition and NAPISEV, the National Association. Oh, I'm messing up their name. Apologies. Um, they are the ones now leading this work. And so if you want to check out more about the SADI project and how you could get training and support from them moving forward, Alex is going to put their link in the chat. Wonderful. So now let's really dig in. What is worth? Worth is the value of something measured by the qualities or by the esteem of which it is held. And worth and worthiness is measured in a variety of ways by different people and different groups. And we'll discuss that more throughout our time together today. But first, it's important that we all have a shared definition of what we mean when we're talking about worth in our time together. Wonderful. So, again, there are going to be different ways throughout our time together today that we are going to be doing some types of engagement. One of those is by using our chat. So, I invite you all to please answer the question on the screen in the chat. And then Alex will read out the answers. Why might survivors struggle with feeling worthy or worthless after sexual violence? Why might survivors struggle with feeling unworthy or worthless after sexual violence?
I am seeing some of the answers being shame, guilt, loss of control, societal stigmas, damaged, losing control again, and they feel that they, in quotes, let it happen. Feeling shame and guilt came up again. I also see the person who caused harm told them this repeatedly, that they let it happen.
Yes, thank you so much, Alex. Are there any more?
Yes, we had one right now, loss of bodily autonomy.
Oh, I love bringing up bodily autonomy. That's going to be a key part of it, right? Thank you all for your answers. And so we'll have several different discussion questions today. So if you weren't able to participate in this one, there'll be different chances. So, and some of you identified this, right? That guilt, that shame, and that blame. One of that and that shame and that blame is one of the things that survivors indicate the most after sexual violence is the most traumatic. So that's a part of what we call the traumatic aftermath of sexual violence. Internally, survivors might hold guilt and shame about their actions or behaviors and blame themselves for the sexual violence that they experienced. And this might sound like it's my fault. I shouldn't have sent the video. I froze up. I didn't say no. I can't believe I trusted them. But it's not just what a survivor says to themselves that can be harmful. It's also this external dialogue or a message that says to the survivor, or things that are said to the survivor directly, and some messages from society that might also make a survivor feel worthless or like they were to blame for what happened to them. That can sound like Well, you shouldn't have been out so late. Why didn't you tell anyone sooner what was happening? I saw you tease them all night long. You should have carried pepper spray. And I think someone earlier also said these might be things that the person that caused harm, or some people might say the perpetrator, might have said to the survivor directly, right? And those are also true. And so here we can understand how some of these things might have been said in good faith, right? These are things like that might be reactive when people tell us that something bad happened. And they might be said as a way to prevent or stop, excuse me, to stop harm from happening again, or to be giving a helpful suggestion. But we always want to remember it's about the impact of the things we say or our statements. That's something that the survivor did or didn't do caused them to experience sexual violence. And that blame and guilt and shame may be both internal and external. And ultimately, survivors internalize the things that they deserve, and they internalize that what happened to them um, is what they deserve, right? So they aren't worth protection or safety from sexual violence. And so I want to be clear that these are the internal and external messages that exist in our society and that survivors have to navigate. But it is the role of the advocate to provide information to survivors and to our communities. And that includes accurately assigning blame for sexual violence. The responsibility does not lie with the survivor, only the person or people who sexually harm them are the people responsible. So, if we want to think a little bit larger, and some of you have already identified that, right? So, these are things society says, these are things people say to survivors. If we want to utilize the socioeconomic model, survivors' worth might be determined at that personal or individual level, or the interpersonal or group level, but it's also determined at that societal level, right? So we have the personal, which is small, and we go a little bit bigger with the group, and then we have societal. And all of these things exist and impact each other. So what happens at the societal level impacts the individual person, and what happens to individual people impacts our society. So, worth as individuals and as a group is determined by the cost of the survivor at the time. And it's determined, we can break down worth from cost, time, and contribution. These are all things that feed into worth. Now, let's break this down a little bit further. So, when we determine and say a part of worth is the cost, it means how much money or resource does this need? For survivors, this looks like trying to cut the cost or money given, even though that's what we as advocates fight against, is often what's prioritized. Lessening that financial cost to support survivors, even if that means cutting the availability and options for support. Is and really the question that's being asked is this individual survivor worth the money or resources needed to provide them support? As a group, do survivors deserve the cost of support for services and other resources? Are survivors really worthy or deserving of having all the costs of medical care covered after a medical forensic exam? That response changes from place to place, right? Time. How much time does this take to produce results, finish, or complete? So, in most cases, when survivor's worth is determined, the survivor who needs less time is determined to be quote unquote more worthy. So, for example, how much time did it take to complete that intake? How much time do we be spending on the phone with just one survivor? How much time will it take to get feedback from all survivors in our community, right? How much time would it take to reach every survivor who needs services? And do we think reaching out to all survivors is worth our time? And this is still different than the time it would take to do things, and that's still a different question, from the time it would take to do things ethically, effectively, and holistically for survivors. The driving measure, when we're measuring worthiness for this, is how efficient or how fast we can get something done. And that often disadvantages survivors. And then we have contribution. So, how much can this person or these survivors contribute? And really, when we're talking about contribution, that boils down to work, right? So, their financial or their economic contribution, even if it's to our families or to our communities. And so, when I was first thinking about contribution and how it tied to worthiness, I was thinking, well, is it really contribution or is it effort, right? Is it really how much effort do they take to meeting the goal, or is it how do they contribute to the goal being met? And from a societal standpoint, it's really about a definite contribution. So think about this a little bit more, right? We might have heard, or you might have heard someone say, trying is not enough. It's about what you can actually do or what you can actually prove or produce. So even in today's webinar, we've already talked about the balance between our intention, what we were trying to do, and the impact. And that's often what society uh, has used the contribution of survivors, right? Not that they tried to do XYZ, but that they actually contribute to whatever is being talked about in the moment. So now we're going to go back to our example of a survivor, Avi, and see how his worth in different areas of life and by his social circle was affected after sexual violence. And so if we're not able to join part one, I'm going to give a summary of what we know about Avi's story. If you're attending the live webinar, you have a slide that explains Avi's story. So as a reminder, Avi is a survivor living in a rural community who was sexually assaulted at his job and then sexually harassed at that same job a few weeks later. He was also discouraged from reporting the sexual violence he experienced before he was fired. So on the left side of the screen, there are three different bubbles, and we will see how Avi was able to quote unquote demonstrate his worth for those around him before he experienced sexual violence. And then on the right side of the screen, we will see how that changed after he experienced sexual violence. So Avi used to live with a roommate and paid his rent on time. After sexual violence, he was 3 months behind on rent and had to ask his family for money. Before Avi experienced sexual violence, he was recognized as Employee of the Month at work. After sexual violence, his supervisor told him, "You're unfocused and clearing your tables too slowly." Before sexual violence, Avi was able to take his niece to soccer practice without a problem. After sexual violence, he wasn't able to do that. His sister said, "You only come around when you need something." So, in each of these examples, we can see how Avi's ability to contribute in terms of the rent and time in completing job duties and in contribution into meeting his family's needs were changed after sexual violence. And the changes that happened for Avi after sexual violence weren't well received by those in his family and in his social circle. And this is typical for people who don't understand trauma and trauma responses. Survivors don't deserve to be negatively perceived after traumatic events, but they often are for not navigating life in the same way they did before the sexual violence. Or if they don't navigate their experience like people who haven't experienced sexual violence or who haven't experienced sexual violence in the same way they did. And so over and over again in this webinar, an overlying theme that we'll keep going back to is who's deserving. Who is deserving of support, of resources? Who is a deserving person in general? And that's because who's deserving is linked to worth. Who deserves to have their needs met, who deserves support, and really who doesn't deserve sexual violence. So, switching gears a little bit, when we think about the rural and urban divide, and I'm always going to be talking about rural because I'm the rural TA coordinator, urban communities and the survivors with them often receive more support than rural communities in terms of resources, representation, and input in political spaces, and in terms of data collection, right? So when research happens, often the data is concentrated in urban areas. And that result really disenfranchises or makes the impact worse in rural communities who don't have what they need and what rural communities deserve. But zooming in a little bit more, within rural communities, the values of survivors within them isn't viewed the same. So within our own communities, and when we start supporting survivors, we need to think about who is perceived or automatically believed when they disclose sexual violence. And why is that? Who is seen as deserving of emotional support? For what situations are they seen as deserving? And what qualities do that group of people have? What qualities does that group of people have? And what do they share in common? Who has access to healing and safety? And in what situations? What can they do to avoid or overcome those barriers more easily than other survivors? So that's what I want us to think about. Within our own rural communities, who is perceived or viewed to be deserving, and which survivors are those? And why is that?
Lachey, I am
Um,
seeing something in the chat. Is it okay to read that out loud?
Absolutely.
Wonderful. My primary work is with PRIA and providing support services to incarcerated survivors of sexual abuse in confinement settings. This law was signed in 2003, and there are little to no prosecutions for inmate on inmate sexual violence. I've recently learned that most prosecutors will not take these cases due to lack of resources, etc.
Thank you so much for reading that, Alex, and thank you so much for sharing that. Absolutely, right. So when we're talking about who is deserving of support, I am not just talking about people based on their background. I'm also talking about based on their experiences, and all different ways that we classify or describe different populations. So now we are going to watch a video. So give me a second for me to switch my screens. Okay. Can you all now see a YouTube screen? Um, do you all see YouTube? Okay, thank you. Just want to make sure. And make sure the volume for the video is on. Wonderful. So we're gonna watch a video now.
Prisoners deserve whatever they get.
Police report described him as 5'9" and 140 pounds. Or as his cellmate put it, just right.
I was forced to perform oral sex on several inmates. I was told, you aren't going to fight back, are you, sweetness?
Oh, you're going to be going back.
And my apologies, everyone. This is Lachey. My apologies. I did not give a content warning. We are going to hear someone's personal experience of sexual violence. It'll be about a 2-minute video, and I will switch back to the PowerPoint slides if you'd rather not hear this experience. I encourage you all to listen because these are things survivors will share with us, but a content warning for those of you who want to want to step away. I'm gonna play the video again now.
back to the showers. And the only speed you're gonna reach is 88 dudes per hour.
Someone's going through that now. Someone's going through that right now. And to make a joke about it, it's a slap in the face. Being raped or sexually assaulted in prison is not part of the punishment. No one deserves that. We're still human beings. There's no guards that sit right here. There's nothing. There was nothing. It's like they had to come from way over here, which is the booking area, to come and see anything that was going on in here.
Hey.
Frank, what the hell are you doing in here?
Shower time.
What are you doing with that loofah?
Don't worry about it.
I was taking a shower, and in comes a guy.
You told me not to worry about it.
He says, "Bitch, face the fucking wall, or I'll break your fucking neck." I felt like dirt. I felt like I didn't even exist. I was just there. My bunk was tapped by a guy who then explained to me that he owned me. He had purchased me from the guy who anally raped me for $20 worth of commissary items.
Okay. So we are back. So I will give everybody a moment to come back because we've switched back to the presentation. Okay. Wonderful, right? And so, um, not wonderful, but thank you all for coming back. So why are we bringing this up and talking about this today? And I promise you all, I did not set up that discussion in the chat. This is an organic thing that happened, but I'm glad it did for our webinar today. So, like Rodney said in the video, even if people are in prison, no one deserves to experience sexual violence, even if we live in a society that minimizes and trivializes the experiences of survivors who experience sexual abuse while in prison. It's also important that we name that rape jokes and blaming survivors are also byproducts of rape culture, which overall diminishes the worth of survivors in our society. 2, jails and prisons are often located in rural communities, so we're discussing incarcerated survivors. That also makes this a rural issue. 3, when sexual violence advocacy overall, incarcerated survivors are underserved. And that's also related to time, cost, and contribution, which we've been talking about today. So when I was a direct service advocate in a rural community and going out to visit an incarcerated survivor, that was a journey. So I would leave pretty early in the morning, and then I would have to drive out to the other town that the facility was located in. Then I would have to wait to be buzzed in to see the survivor, and that could take between 30 minutes and an hour for processing. Then have my meeting with the survivor, then have to do the processing again, and then drive back to my work office. Sometimes I would go home because that would be the extent of my work day. And so to do that, that took mileage that would be different from me usually driving around town to meet with other survivors or over the phone. There was more distance. And so all of these things went into serving incarcerated survivors. And maybe we've never thought about it like this, but do our services and how we do our advocacy really show that incarcerated survivors are worthy of our support? And I know, right, that when I would do this, there was some feedback about like you are spending all day meeting this one person when you could be seeing multiple people in this day, right? That's just some of the feedback that we're taught. Other people are focusing on time spent, our finances, and so on and so forth. But again, what are we saying and who are we saying is worthy of our support? And when we think about it, when funding cuts have to be made, oftentimes when our funding is cut, incarcerated survivors and services to incarcerated survivors are usually the first to be cut down or cut back in some way. But what is the economic cost of sexual violence? Right? So we talked about how survivors are viewed and how their worth is broken down into time, contribution, and cost. But what is the economic cost of sexual violence? Well, the CDC, or the Center for Disease Control, broke this down. They found that the lifetime cost of rape is estimated to $122,461 per survivor, times the 25 million reported victims of rape in the United States, equals to a $3.1 trillion cost in the lifetime for sexual violence, right? $3.1 trillion. And if you're interested in the research like I was, that cost per survivor was determined by a victim's impaired health, as well as the loss of productivity and criminal justice activities. And what they've identified as productivity in the study more closely aligns with what we've been describing as contribution in this webinar. So a couple of different things. And again, I am a person who likes research. I like data. I like numbers to compare. But the average annual salary in the US currently is $66,662 a year. That means that the average person living in the United States would have to work almost 2 full years to pay off the economic costs of sexual violence. And again, that's not if survivors are paying for food, for transportation, for childcare, for health, all the different things, right? If someone did nothing else, the average person in the United States would have to work for full years to pay off the economic costs. And what if there are multiple survivors in your family? What if there are multiple survivors and generations across your family, right? And how does that impact the economics? And so we know that a lot of survivors don't make $66,000 a year, right? So depending on what they make, that can take even more time. And remember, this is the cost of survivors and to system productivity, not the cost given to the person that harmed them, right? So this is the cost survivors have to take on. Another way to think about this question, if you're not really into the data as much, is do survivors deserve the economic cost of experiencing sexual violence? Also, $3 trillion is a lot of money by most accounts, right? So imagine if that money could be spent on other things survivors need, or given back to survivors, or that money is put into victim services. What does all this mean, Lachey? Why are you bringing this up? I really want us to understand that the economic cost, beyond the emotional and cost to our society of sexual violence, is great, but it's not equal to the cost or worth of sexual violence survivors. And Alex, there's another comment in the chat. If you could read that one out loud, I would appreciate it.
Yes, just did not know when to pop in there. It says the majority of the incarcerated population will return to the community with the trauma they experienced while serving time. It robs them of so much that will affect them when they return to the community. There is a need for more advocates to provide services, but resources are already stretched in rural communities and affect the ability and capacity to provide these much needed services to this population. and in rural communities, it costs so much more.
Thank you for your diligence and your reading. Absolutely right. And when we talk about stretching a dollar in rural communities, it means something different. And we could talk about the economic cost of sexual violence uh for rural sexual violence survivors in another webinar if that's what you all would like. So bringing all this together, right? How has society affected survivors' individual but also collective worth after sexual violence? So if survivors are internalizing messages that they are deserving or to blame for the sexual violence that they experience, if they are viewed or portrayed as not producing in society or being a burden on society, and then they're being shamed and blamed for the trauma that they experience, along with that economic burden individually, but also collectively as a group, that it's not a surprise that survivors might feel worthless or unworthy. If that message is coming from so many outlets, that can be their reality. It shows up in conversations and funding decisions and in policies. And all of that leads to further harm and trauma for rural survivors, but also and for rural communities. And I want us to sit with that just for a moment. All right. So we've sat with that. So I encourage you all to shake that feeling out of your bodies. So now we can shift to how we can use worth as an advocacy frame. So wherever you are, just take a moment to shake that out a little bit, to stretch and to move because we carry trauma in our bodies and part of trauma is the things that we hear and what we absorb. So just take a moment to shake. All right. So now we are going to do a Mentimeter. Uh, for those of you who have never used Mentimeter before, it is a way to do anonymous polling in the moment. So live polling in the moment. So what I'm going to encourage you all to do if you'd like to participate is go to www.menti.com and then type in the code 72727868. Or if you're a little bit more tech adept, you can point your camera at the QR code and it will take you to the Mentimeter. Alex will also put the link in the chat if you're on your computer. And I'll give you all a moment to pull it up before I switch screens. All right, I'm going to switch screens now. All right. So you all should be seeing the Mentimeter screen now. And the question is, what do survivors deserve? So we identified all the things that they didn't deserve and why they might feel that way earlier. But I want to ask you all as advocates, those who are working directly with survivors, what do survivors deserve? And this is a word cloud. So the more people say a word, the bigger we'll get as more people add to the Mentimeter. What do survivors deserve? Wonderful. So I'm going to start reading the answers now. They deserve support, compassion, to be heard, empathy, love, belief, listening. grace, treated with respect, patience, positive self regard, a sense of justice, equity, making their own choices, to feel safe or safe spaces, not to be labeled, to heal, reparations, listening, their form of justice, understanding, rest, truth, restitution, kindness, serenity, peace, or peaceful life, unbiased justice. Yeah, I really appreciate all of these answers. And I agree, survivors deserve all of these different things. And I'm glad that you all are already so in tune with the things that survivors deserve. So thank you. And after this webinar, I'm going to send everyone who attended a PDF of this Mentimeter slide so you all have it. You deserve to have the work that you contributed to. So give me a second and I will switch back to the PowerPoint. So beyond and outside of our services, survivors deserve to have their needs met, right? Now, if you watched the previous webinar that we did on hope, you might have seen a similar chart to this before, but I repurposed it to highlight what survivors deserve, and especially in rural communities, they deserve resources. Now, later on in the presentation, we will talk about what services we can offer to demonstrate worth. But rural survivors deserve the resources that they need to live happy and thriving lives, and it's our job as advocates to help them access it. And particularly in rural communities, many of these resources are harder to come by, so we need to advocate for policies and initiatives that can help survivors in obtaining these things. So they are phone and internet connection, basic needs and benefits, natural disaster support, affordable housing, jobs and education, and healthcare. And I know, particularly during the government shutdown, and especially rural programs in particular, we're being diligent about asking survivors that they were working with if they needed food boxes, and if they couldn't provide it directly, sharing resources and transporting survivors to those resources where they could receive food. And that is, again, a necessary service. If survivors don't have what they need, then they're not going to be able to heal. Now, let's link what we're talking about, what survivors deserve, back to those self identified needs. And so, when we say survivors are worthy of being believed, for us, that's an actionable thing. It's having others listen, empathize, and want to respond after what they shared. And that's not just from our programs, even though it should be, but also from their loved ones, from social media, from their jobs, school, and everywhere they go to share. It's also telling their story and being immediately met with support, not disbelief or discomfort or with scrutiny. Survivors also deserve to be able to utilize services when they need to. And to be clear, right? It shouldn't matter whether a survivor calls the helpline once or a dozen times, because we believe that if they're calling, they're doing so because that's what they need for their healing and their support. It's not just a theory, right, that we believe survivors. We actually believe them and support them, and we can see this as advocating for their own needs, which feeds into that next point. We want, and when we say we believe survivors, that means receiving funds directly to get what they need. We, as our programs, can continue to serve as like a central point for survivors, but when we unclench our fists and our jaws, right, when we really believe survivors, we release our need for control because we believe survivors should be able to identify what they need for their healing and have access to the money directly. And then these last 2 points are related, right? So free from victim blaming and a society where the truths about sexual violence are well known. Survivors deserve a society where people can just as easily describe the truths and facts about sexual violence and not just those myths about sexual violence. Instead of being able to only name some victim blaming statements, they are instead invested in strategies to prevent and respond to sexual violence because they believe that survivors deserve better as well. If survivors are worthy of emotional support, then they are worth interacting with people who understand responses to trauma. And those people are communicative and they're skilled at holding space. That means folks who have resources but are not rushing survivors to go to their next appointment or their next call or whatever they have to do, who know how to listen and help survivors, whether that's face to face, over the phone, or over chat or in a virtual space, and with people who know how to manage and respond to vicarious trauma and can have their own self care practice. This also means holding space for survivors in whatever way they need, but specifically holding space for them to feel their full range of emotion. And that person or that advocate can be a safe container for those emotions without fear. It also means that they deserve to have their feelings recognized as an essential part of their safety and their safety planning and also for their healing. And not only is it recognized as something essential for their safety and for their healing, they are able to support survivors in all types of safety that they need, but specifically with emotional safety. And we're talking about safety in all of these different areas of hurt and healing. And if survivors are worthy of healing and support, they are worthy of receiving the healing how, and when and how that best fits their needs. They deserve healing and safety that supports the unique and plentiful ways that they wanted and multiple service options and supports to choose from. Healing has to be self defined by that survivor and when they are ready, and they deserve to get support without barriers or without shame. Instead, we want survivors to be celebrated and welcome when they are ready to receive that support. They're also able to do this in a secure way. So at our programs, we are should and we should be doing what we can to help survivors navigate unsafe situations and not just by hiding survivors away or disappearing survivors, but by preparing them with the tools that they need to navigate the world. We're also making sure that, especially in rural programs, we're maintaining survivors' privacy and viewing survivors sharing more information with us as a development of trust, not as survivors withholding or manipulating us, because they deserve our trust and we respect that they have the full autonomy to share what they want when they want. All right. And so I want to ask you all a slightly different questions, right? What do survivors deserve from our services or from our programs, right? So before that was a little bit more general, but I want to know what you all think now. What do survivors deserve from our services or from our programs?
Okay, as they start to come in, I am seeing autonomy, equity, autonomy, equity, patience, trauma informed, trust, as much decision-making power as possible, privacy and dignity, trust again, power and control, professional and knowledgeable advocates, follow through, respect.
Thank you all so much for your responses, right? So we know what survivors deserve, right? And you all were able to give plenty of different examples of what survivors deserve, right? And so I want us to hold on to that for our time together today. And so as we're wrapping up this section and thinking about all the things that survivors deserve from us and from sexual violence services, then we have to remember that many advocates are also survivors and therefore also deserve better. And that's for the supervisors in ED, but also for our advocate to advocate interactions at our organizations. So going back to the SADI lessons, and that's SADI lessons, the fifth lesson is, and I'm going to read it now, programs must attend to the well-being of their staff of the organization as a whole. The extent to which programs support their own staff was seen as directly influencing the quality of services that could be provided to survivors. So, again, don't just take my word for it. The research and the data supports the idea that to better support survivors, we need to have a safe, professional workspace and environment. And that's not just the physical workspace that we do, that advocates are in, but also clear defined roles within their organizations, having boundaries at work respected, which some of you all said for survivors, right? Present and balanced supervision, investment in their professional development and growth, and pay and compensation needed to sustain their livelihoods. And again, this is how we move from the theoretical, we believe survivors, we believe they deserve XYZ, to the actual step. And that has to include survivor advocates as well. And so before we go to our break, I want to leave you all with some reflection questions to start assessing and reflecting on how survivors in your community and in our communities deserve and what they deserve from our programs. What do survivors receiving services from our programs deserve? What do survivors in our community deserve? How would these things be different if survivors got what they deserved from programs? So, how would our funding be different? How would our systems advocacy be different? And how would our different awareness or public service campaigns be different? And if we really want to dig deeper and into the middle of the thing of worth, right? We can ask which populations are deserving of our services. How do we know that? And how is that reflected in who we actually serve? At the core of all these questions is how do we demonstrate what survivors are worth to us? And how do we demonstrate that survivors are worthy through our funds, how we spend them, or the cost to support survivors, through our time, and through our contribution to their growth, development, and healing? All right. So, our last thing before we take a break, how would our world be different if survivors got what they deserved? How would we communicate different? How would we drive differently? How would we work differently? How would we, as advocates, but just in general, how would we be differently? And just keep that thought in mind as we go into our break. To narrow in a little bit on our role as advocates, we have, in our time together, recognized that survivors aren't getting what they deserve and identified what they do deserve from our programs. So we know, right? We know what survivors deserve. We know what they deserve from our programs. So now, what are we going to do about that? How do we reconcile what survivors deserve with what we're actually doing? And I'm asking myself that as well, right? What am I, Lachey, gonna do to make sure survivors get what they need from Iowa CASA? What am I gonna make sure that survivors get what they deserve from me and my advocacy on the state and the national level, but also in my community where I live? We know that that's not going to happen overnight, but we each have a responsibility to close the gap every day that we call ourselves advocates. We're not there yet, but we have to keep trying to get there. And that's okay as long as we keep trying. All right. So, with that, we've been talking for a little bit. So, we're going to take a break. So, I encourage you all to get up from your computers, and then we will come back into putting it into practice next. All right. Welcome back. Alex, are there any questions or things that we should be seeing from the chat?
We did not have anything left in the chat or in the Q&A section, so I think we're good to go.
Wonderful. Okay, let's keep going. All right. So now that we're grounded in the why, let's focus on how we can utilize worth as an advocacy frame. So ultimately, if survivors are feeling worthless and devalued, our services and our support that we offer should assist them in discovering and rediscovering their value. And every place that they're feeling undervalued or downplayed or their worth is not being utilized. If survivors' experiences are going unheard and unaddressed, it's our role as advocates to amplify and make space for and validate their contributions. So, with survivors, here are some guiding questions we can ask ourselves and ask survivors to help survivors start to understand and discussing worth. What does worth mean to you? What actions can we take to help survivors believe that their voices, their experiences, and their contributions are valuable? What can we do to show survivors that they matter? So, as early as possible, we want to introduce to survivors that their worth is not something that they earn. Again, worth is not something that they can earn. They are worthy of having what they need and being safe simply because they are them and because they are human. This should extend also to survivors who might have passed away. And that might seem a little bit strange because usually we focus, when we say survivors, on those who are living. But when we are talking about survivors or victims of sexual violence, they are also worthy of having their stories shared as they desired with consent and if they desire. This could also look like making space for survivors to explore their ideas about worth and especially where their ideas about self worth came from. Like, what are some things that make us feel worthy or unworthy? What has happened in our life to make us feel worthy or worthless? What was said? What was the impact of those messages or what we were told? How have we been seen or deemed worthy and unworthy by our families, our communities, our loved ones, and in society? What are some of the things that we can do as survivor to survivor to let each other know that we're worthy, even if we don't feel it in the moment? And so that can be a discussion that you have with survivors in a group, that can be in a one on one discussion. Um, Again, just to introduce the idea of worth so it's not some complex thing that they don't understand, right? We have self worth. And to start thinking about where our ideas about our self worth come from. In our advocacy skills, something we can do to embody or show survivors are worthy is to make sure that we're sharing and gathering information. And that was said a couple different times already in our discussions. We know that oftentimes survivors are deemed unworthy or undeserving of having information. And that's not necessarily from our programs, but by and in different systems and their families or by their loved ones and in other places as well. So in that sharing of information, and when we do share information, we are demonstrating that survivors are trustworthy and they're worthy of having information that they need to make decisions. They are worthy of being informed, and that survivors deserve access to information and they deserve access to what they need. This could be something like it looks like your apartment has been overcharging you for parking. Do you want to call them and find out what this is about? I'll be here to support you. This is also intertwined with reminding survivors of things and actions and behaviors that they do and don't deserve. This could be like they deserve to be safe and have fun. They don't deserve to be lied to and deceived. They deserve to have people that they trust support them, even if those people disagree with their decisions. They deserve some of the things that you all identified previously from our programs as well, right? These are things that survivors deserve, and sometimes naming those things is really helpful. Building and rebuilding a survivor's sense of who they are, a trustworthy and capable person who experienced something harmful, and what they can contribute, what they would like to do in a potentially different way after they experience trauma is also going to be an important thing that we can do. Now, how we go about doing that is going to be unique to every survivor. But we want to be kind, gentle, and direct when we're responding to blaming and shaming of survivors' behaviors and actions, especially when it comes to their sexual violence experiences, just like we want them to be gentle with themselves. Worth is also about being present and providing survivors with the emotional support that they deserve, which we will dive into a little bit later. But if survivors deserve emotional support, we should be able to discuss with survivors and have strategies for them to develop their sense of worth and the impact of their trauma, to understand their individual strengths, and to create a sense of personal worth in their body, and how to reconnect, or find new passions. So not only does this directly address those feelings of worth or unworthiness, these feelings of like, well, I don't deserve to cry, or I don't deserve, or I don't know if I really am worth space to process my feelings. But providing emotional support can also help distance the idea that their sense of worth is tied to what and how they produce for others. And that's going to be really important, again, when our self worth is often determined by the opinions of other people around us. But when we do this work and focus on emotional support, we can help separate those two things. Instead, their sense of worth can be tied to what they need for themselves and how they might contribute differently in life if they choose. And this also acknowledges how their life has been affected by trauma, but that doesn't change their worth. There are also key strategies that we can take to establish worthiness for survivors themselves in our community and then also larger in society. And again, these are rooted with how worth is determined. The first one is investing our funding and time into survivors' growth healing, and development. And so to do this, we're going to have an understanding first of the barriers that prevent survivors from healing and growing. And then our part of our work also is removing those barriers. So for a lot of survivors, we know that the barriers to getting what they deserve are financial. So we can either pay survivors directly so they can invest in the future that they deserve, or we can find opportunities and hold those spaces ourselves. So some different examples are holding healing retreats for survivors, providing litigation support, to host and find skill building opportunities, and that can be in the form of tuition payments or reimbursements, helping survivors get their certifications and licensure needs, uh, financial literacy classes, and health education opportunities. And particularly when we invest in survivors, we're showing them that they deserve to have access, that they deserve to have the things that they need to, again, find stability and security in their lives. And I know I want to acknowledge, right, that there are funding cuts happening for a lot of us. And I'm not saying that we have to be the ones to fund all of these things, right? But this is where our community partnerships can really help us. Survivors also deserve opportunities to explore safety after sexual violence, and somatics is one of the ways to do that. So, how many of you all have heard of somatics before? And if you have, you can say yes in the chat or some type of reaction. How many of you all have heard of somatics before? Seen a couple of emoji reactions. Okay. So if you haven't, that's okay. We're going to learn a little bit about it today in this video. And this is a little bit longer of a video, but it's really, really good information. So I am going to start the video now.
Dr. Levine, how does somatic experiencing help in treatment of cases of sexual abuse?
Well, sexual abuse is, of course, one type of trauma. But it's a very special kind of trauma in the following way. First of all, it's somebody invading your most inner space, your most sacred inner space. Second is that very frequently molestation, sexual abuse, occurs within the family. Either a stepfather, a relative, a neighbor, a neighborhood boy, an older neighborhood boy. And often there are prohibitions about telling. They're either threatened or the child knows that if they do tell, that the family may fall apart. So it's much more complicated, of course. But still, the basic ideas are similar. That is to say, for the person to recover their own sense of power, empowerment, to be able to learn how to set boundaries, to be able to reawaken their bodies so that they can feel deep pleasure. See, one of the things that happens when you've been abused, molested, or raped is that when people begin, for example, when they're having sex with the people that they choose to have sex with, that as soon as they start getting aroused, they become terrified, or they shut down, or they dissociate. And the reason for that is, well, or the way that people can be helped for that is when they start to experience those sensations, those feelings, if they again learn to let those sensations and feelings move through them, and if they can in therapy to feel their own sense of power, their own sense of boundaries, their own self-compassion and self-forgiveness, because many people have punished themselves because of the shame for their whole lives, and the shame has crippled them in some ways even more than than the sexual trauma itself. So it's, as you work with people, they, in this way, we do in somatic experiencing, you see pretty well universally this increase in self-acceptance, self-compassion, and then when you are able to work with that, and they're able to return to some of these deeper sensations, these sensations of pleasure. Now, often what happens again when a couple is beginning a sexual embrace, that there are sexual feelings. Sort of what goes on is this deep belief system that if I feel pleasure, then I will make it okay for what was done to me. Or it gives that it says that it's okay that they did it. And it's sort of like, so they say to themselves, in addition to all of the shock and the trauma, they say to themselves, I will never let anybody see me feel these kinds of feelings again. So you have to work with that aspect as well. And when I work with people who have sexual abuse histories, I don't consider the therapy completed if they just reduce their symptoms like anxiety or depression, but really only until they've restored a full, deep capacity for intimate sexual pleasure.
Okay. So a couple of things that I want to address in the video. We know people of all backgrounds and identities experience and cause sexual harm, first off. Next, I really like this video because, again, when we're talking about what survivors deserve to be able to have normative experiences after sexual violence. And that is engaging in consensual sex if they'd wish. Survivors deserve to have access to some of those health education opportunities, and somatics can be one of those things, right? Survivors deserve advocates who are comfortable talking and explaining how for survivors can help. Survivors deserve advocates who are able to help them navigate sexual experiences after sexual violence as well, and advocates who are comfortable doing so, right? And so, again, when we think about the services that we can offer, somatics is one of them. Helping survivors navigate and explore new experiences after sexual violence is also another one. Another service that we can offer is to respond to victim blaming. So, again, if the need is for emotional support, we can help survivors navigate these feelings coming from their own thoughts and things also projected at them from others. So, here's an example of what this can look like on the slide. If a survivor is sharing that I shouldn't have sent that video, we can respond. People send videos every day that aren't shared without their consent. How does that make you feel? Now, if you remember the internal/external dialogue slide from earlier, this is one of the internal blame statements that survivors might think and feel. And in this example, the communication skills that we're using are to clarify and to check in. When we share factual information that counters blame statements, it reestablishes that sending the video is not the problematic or harmful behavior in the scenario, and it normalizes that behavior. The problematic behavior, the actual violation of consent, was what the other person did. And this response also checks in with the survivor to see how that information lands for them or how they're reacting to it. Initially, in this example, we're demonstrating how we can disagree respectfully, disrupt self blame, and emphasize that how the survivor interprets it, not the advocate, is what's most important. And so, if you all want some other examples of how this can be done, we have a resource that Alex put in the chat. It's called Unpacking the Gray Area, and that is available on the Resource Sharing Project website. Let's do another example. If the survivor is sharing, I can't believe I trusted them. An example of how they can respond is, it sounds like they misused your trust in them, so they should feel guilty about what happened, not you. So in this example, we are using our skill of redirecting and again checking in to reestablish that the person who sexually harmed them misused their power and misused the trust that the survivor had in them. Again, this reminds survivors that trusting people is not the problem, and it's what the other people did, in this case, misuse their trust. And that person is to blame and not the survivor. I also want to just put out there that we also want to be careful with saying, like, you shouldn't feel anyway, because we don't tell survivors how to feel. So now that we've gone through two examples, I would like to see what suggestions that you all would give in this scenario. So if a survivor said to you what's in this black speech bubble, and I'll read it out loud, how this is what Avi, and again, Avi is a survivor that we've been working with for our series. This is what their spouse said to them after he was fired. So Avi's spouse said, "Why didn't you tell me what was happening sooner?" How and what response can we give that could help Avi respond? Why didn't you tell me sooner what was happening?
Okay, the first one we have is let him know that survivors all disclose or heal on their own individual time frame, not what others feel that it should be. Another answer is ask them if they were ready to talk about it.
Thank you. Yeah, I think those are both great suggestions, right? Not what anyone like survivors should be doing. Ask Avi if they're ready to talk about it, right? That is absolutely some things that we should be doing. We can also make sure that we can say things like, Avi, are you ready to talk about it? Or and when Avi, if we are helping Avi respond, we could say like, one of the responses you could give is like, you told your spouse when you were ready, right? That's when you told them. Or this is not something that you planned to happen, but this is how you're able to respond in the moment and what this has been like for you if they're ready. So thank you for those of you who responded. So here are some other things that we can help survivors do in responding to blame and shame. So, first and foremost, we want to reemphasize that no one deserves sexual violence. And so, everyone in the way that survivors navigate their sexualized experience is what they need to do. We want to make sure that we are normalizing survivors' feelings, explaining the body's response to trauma and stimuli, making spaces for survivors to unpack their experiences, placing responsibility on the person that caused them harm, and practicing scenarios for survivors to do boundary work with other people. So, again, if you want strategies for how this can look like in each of these categories, we have a resource available called Unpacking the Gray Area. I also want to emphasize that harm reduction strategies should not be highlighted as ways to prevent sexual violence because those can be victim blaming. And again, those strategies are how to avoid sexual harm, but they do not stop or interrupt the cycles of it happening. And if you'd like to learn more about that, please hold on to the end of the webinar and we'll talk about some opportunities where you might be able to do that. Another service that we can offer is to hold and make space for survivors' different experiences. So, again, when we are intentionally holding space, we recognize survivors as sharers of their experience and can help create spaces and opportunities for them to advocate for themselves. So, some different examples are paid, and I want to underline paid survivor panels, survivor advisory spaces, survivor share outs. You might know these better as survivor circles or survivor speak outs, peer-led policy spaces, and having opportunities where survivors can serve as expert reviewers. So we can demonstrate that survivors are worthy of sharing their own story and their expertise. And not only is it a valuable contribution, but that it's a contribution that's worth paying for. We want to emphasize that survivors are worthy of having their own spaces to build their skills, to connect with others, and to build their collective power to change things for themselves. I also want to focus on a couple of things right here too, right? So we want to make sure that if we are asking survivors to share their stories, we want to be vetting these opportunities, right, and giving survivors all the information. And we want to be compensating survivors for sharing their story. When we pay survivors and compensate survivors, we are demonstrating that they deserve to be paid for sharing and that their stories are marketable if they so choose. All right, so those are like theoretical ideas so that you all can do. And if you want more information on how to do specific ideas, we can talk about them. But because I love to give you all tangible things that you can do right when you get off the webinar, here's another idea that you can do and demonstrate survivors' worth. So, a reminder, in using worth as an advocacy frame, when survivors feel worthless or when whoever you're doing this activity with feels worthless and devalued, it's our role to help them to rediscover their value. And so this is a way that we can do that in real time. So this activity is called Cheer Squad. And what you will need for this activity is you'll need at least 4 people, but the bigger the group, the better. What you're going to do is split the group into split the groups in half. So there's going to be 2 different sides. The prompt that you will give is, okay, what you are going to do is one side or one team and the other is going to cheer for the other team as if they just won the best prize in the world. It could be $1 million, a large amount of money, they ended sexual violence, whatever prompt that you want to give, but a prompt that they are going to get really excited about. Then for a full 2 minutes, this side is going to cheer for the other side as if they did it. A full 2 minutes. The other group is then just going to absorb that and think about what this feels like. Then we are going to switch. Okay, so the group does it for a full 2 minutes. They cheer, they yell, they scream. However, they demonstrate that what they did was excellent or worth admiration, right? Then you switch, and then team two will then do the cheering for team one. Now, after the activity has ended, again, this should only take about 5 minutes tops. You can have a discussion with both teams about what it felt like to do the cheering and what it felt like to receive that praise. And the point of this activity is it allows people to see in real time their worth, right? If they did something amazing. And we can end the activity by saying, you already are amazing. We hope you feel that way all the time. But this is a way that we can show that we are worth admiration. We are worth people praising us. We are worth having a cheer squad behind us, right? And so I really like this activity because it can explore individual feelings about worth and worthiness. And it can also do it as a group and have that discussion as well. And you really don't need any additional tools rather than people to do this activity. And this is another way that we can start to build and help survivors build and rebuild their self esteem, which is also tied to our sense of self worth. And I really want to shout out T, who used to work at the North Carolina Coalition Against Sexual Assault, for teaching us this activity. Another tangible way that we can demonstrate survivors' worth is through social media. Now, almost daily, I know I am seeing ways that survivors' worth is being diminished online. But social media is just like every other tool. The way we use it is how it can impact survivors. So we can use social media as a way to amplify to society that survivors are worthy. And because we don't want you all to duplicate any work, we are sharing a resource that we already made to demonstrate survivors' worth before this webinar even happened or was even conceptualized. We had already posted this on our social media. Now, again, because we don't want you all to have to duplicate the work, that resource is already in your chat. Is it going to be in your chat? We have created a PDF so you can just take the graphic and then change it how you need to. We've put it as pictures in our Dropbox link. And if you're also already using Canva in your advocacy work, we have included a link where you can download it on Canva and then change it how you wish if you don't want our branding on it or you want to use more specific words that represent your community, right? The point is, we want to show in every place that survivors are interacting with that they are worthy. And then the last thing that we want to do is amplify survivors' worth. Um, and again, that is in any spaces that we are in. We want to make sure that everyone knows that survivors are deserving of all the support and options that are available to them, and they deserve funding. That survivors are worthy of their time and effort to provide services to, and survivors deserve uh, to demonstrate the ways that they do contribute to society after sexual violence. That no one is worthless, even if the way they demonstrate their worth changes after sexual violence. That is also part of our mandate or what we're supposed to do as advocates. All right. So we have one more section today, and this is our practical skill build. Our guiding questions for this part are: what skills can advocates use to demonstrate survivors' worth? And what can we do to support their self esteem? What skills? So, for today, we're going to focus on that empathetic and active listening. Overall, and what we'll be discussing throughout the rest of the series are the other four skills that we use to provide emotional support. But we're going to focus on active listening because that skill is needed to do all the other skills that we're going to talk about throughout the series. Now, usually when I train on the 5 skills and when we do this in person, we start with empathetic and active listening because, again, if we're not able to do this, we won't be able to do the other skills. And this is important because many people who have experienced sexual violence didn't have people who even listened to them when they disclosed. If they did have someone, the response wasn't what they wanted or what they needed, or it didn't happen enough. And so, as advocates, we might be one of the few people, or maybe even the first person, who was able to hear their story. And so, it's important that we know how to listen empathetically. All right, so now we're going to watch another really short video, but it's important for our understanding of why we put the empathy next to active listening.
Out of 3,500 colors, we chose the one color to best represent 2026. Introduce
Perspective taking. So what is empathy and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, climb down. I know what it's like down here. And you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no. You want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
Okay. So before we were just calling this active listening, right? Or just listening, right? And then we added active listening. And then we added empathetic listening, right? Because that closes the distance of our listening while still being balanced and regulated within ourselves. So when we're listening to survivors, we want to feel with them in that moment, even if there isn't any other tangible thing that we can do for them. And if we're able to do that, if we're able to sit with them in their pain or in their trauma and in their feelings of unworthiness, then that is a service, and that's not something that everyone can do well. All right. So this is the last chat question I have for you all today. And I thank you all for participating where you have. What are some things that you do to demonstrate that you're actively listening to survivors? What are some things that you do to demonstrate that you're actively listening to survivors?
So I see eye contact, open-ended questions, body language. Repeat back to them what they said to ensure I'm fully understanding the series of events. Validating their feelings. When there is a quiet space in the conversation, I will paraphrase what they have stated. Sorry. Face them and make eye contact if they're comfortable with that. And somebody put, I say something to the effect of, what I hear you say is thanking them for sharing.
Thank you so much, Alex, for reading the responses. Absolutely. Those sound like the things I was going to share with you, all right? We want to make sure that we're giving the person our full and active attention. So if you are a person who maybe struggles with memory, I think stating out loud, like, I'm going to be taking notes, but I am paying attention, and this is how I pay attention. When I am meeting with survivors, I am usually a doodler. So I am known to have like fidgets under my desk so my hands aren't visible. But when I'm with, for example, Alex as my coworker, if I'm doodling and I'm nodding my head, then she can tell that I'm paying attention because we have that established relationship. And so again, what's important, even our empathetic and active listening, is that relationship and how we form that connection. We also want to be mindful of our body language, our facial expressions, our pacing, and our tone. So I know that for myself, when I am dysregulated, when my emotions are not under control, my tone gets higher, my pacing is quicker. So we just want to be mindful of how that shows up in our bodies when we're feeling the different types of emotions. And as much as possible with survivors, and to do that deep, slow, intentional, active listening, we want to be regulated. We also want to make sure that we are observing changes that we notice in the person and share them when appropriate. So, for example, Alex, I noticed that you're apologizing. I just want you to know that I appreciate how you've shown up in this webinar and how you're helping me today, right? For Survivor, I might say, I noticed that you haven't said anything in a little while. What's coming up for you? These are ways that we can gently re-engage, um, verbalize what we are noticing, and let them know that we're still there to support them. All right, so we have one more video, and it's important, so I'm still gonna share it. And this one is also quick to show what active listening for the advocates can look like and why it's important that we truly are just listening.
It's just, there's all this pressure, you know? And sometimes it feels like it's right up on me and I can just feel it, like literally feel it in my head, and it's relentless. And I don't know if it's going to stop. I mean, that's the thing that scares me the most, is that I don't know if it's ever going to stop.
Yeah. Well, you do have a nail in your head.
It is not about the nail.
Are you sure? Because, I mean, I'll bet if we got that out of there...
Stop trying to fix it.
No, I'm not trying to fix it. I'm just pointing out that maybe the nail is causing...
You always do this. You always try to fix things when what I really need is for you to just listen.
See, I don't think that is what you need. I think what you need is to get the nail
See,
out.
you're not even listening now.
Okay, fine. I will listen. Fine.
It's just, sometimes it's like there's this achy, I don't know what it is. And I'm not sleeping very well at all. And all my sweaters are snagged. I mean, all of them.
Yeah, that sounds really hard.
It is. Thank you. Ow!
Come on. Ow. If you would just...
Don't...
Try to see things my way.
Okay, so that was a more comedic example of what active listening can look like. But again, even in this example, it was not about what he thought she needed, to recommend what he thought she needed, to tell her what he thought would solve her problem. Sometimes what people genuinely need for us is just to listen. By listening, then we're not assuming what people need. We're not cutting off people before they can tell us. And no matter what we think might be the solution or the problem at the moment, that might not be it for the survivor. So we need to just listen. And again, listening is going to require time. And I'm not saying that we should not be helping survivors problem solve. What I'm saying is that we need to listen first and then move to problem solving. Okay, I'm gonna make sure I didn't skip. Okay, didn't skip anything. All right. So, what are some of the things that we can do when we're active listening? Honestly, it's some of you all had said these things already, some of the strategies, and there is another handout that in the chat for you all that describes these things in more detail. But some examples that you can do are paraphrasing. So, not if I say I feel sad, not saying I heard you say you feel sad. You're feeling sad, right? So to rephrase what someone said in a shorter way, making room for silence. So, as advocates, we have to realize that different people might need different times to process or to pause before they share further. So, we ourselves have to be really comfortable in making room for silence and then also know how to re engage someone. So, that opening and closing as an advocacy skill. We also want to make sure that as much as possible, we are mirroring the terms that survivors are using. So a survivor might say, my boyfriend, they might say, my boo, they might say, my partner. And then as much as possible, we want to use those phrases to describe the same phrase to describe what that survivor did in the moment. We also want to make sure that we are taking time to address the physiological responses of sexual violence, right? And that in particular can be really helpful for men who've experienced sexual violence for things like arousal and stimuli, which again are our body's natural response to any type of stimuli that happens. And so that can be really important in survivors not blaming their bodies for, again, how they responded to the violence that they experienced. And so I like to make sure that I give you all plenty of examples to pull from. Here are some different examples for empathetic and active listening. And we want to try as much as possible to focus on the feeling when we're listening that people share. And again, we may not be able to fix it or define the problem for them, but we can listen to what's being shared. That might sound like what I heard you say was, it sounds like you're upset when you weren't able to go to dinner last night. Did I get that right? I'm okay with silence if you need time to think or process. We also want to take time to show that we're engaged and that the person has our full and non judgmental attention. What can I do to be helpful to you in this moment? What do you need? I'm noticing that you're looking down at your phone a lot. Is everything okay? And then we also want to make sure that we're intentionally taking time to provide validation when survivors need it. So even in the video, we heard him say, that sounds really hard. It's okay to feel emotional when you think about what happened. Trauma can make us react in ways we don't want to. That doesn't make it any less difficult to deal with. Right. So providing validation not for just survivors' feelings, but for their actions and also their experiences as well can be a really helpful way to demonstrate that we're active listening. All right. And so we are winding down in our time together. So we have three quick polls, and I think we're going to focus on just two of them for our time together. Actually, let me do a quick time check. All right, yeah, we're gonna focus on two polls. So we'll do this first one. And so I'm going to put the poll up right now, but please answer this question. If this is what Avi said to us, what active listening skills could we use to respond to him? I was erect after what happened. You can see it in the video. And so as a reminder, after Avi was sexually assaulted, the person that sexually assaulted him came back and filmed him while he was in the bathroom. And so his response, as your advocate, this is what he's sharing with you. I was erect after what happened. You can see it in the video. So I'm going to put the poll up now. And I want you all to think about which active listening technique could you use in this scenario? Could you use paraphrasing, making room for silence, building on past successes, validation and encouragement, clarifying, checking in, summarizing, mirroring, questioning, normalizing and prioritizing, opening, closing, grounding, addressing blame and shame, and addressing physiological responses. And you should be able to select multiple options. Okay, we're pulling at about 35%. I want to see if I can get a little bit higher before I show the answers. All right. So I'll give everybody 10 more seconds and then I'll close out this poll. Okay, so when I was thinking about this, in reality, I'm sure if I asked you all to share what you would say or what you would share, most of these would be right, right? But some of the ones that I could see off the bat were validating and encouragement to clarify, right? So, um, Avi, I just want to let you know that uh, being erect after sexual violence experience does not mean you wanted it, right? That is how our body responds to stimuli. When we're embarrassed, our body does what it needs to in that moment to protect us. We don't get to decide that. Checking. And then the other ones were addressing blame and shame and addressing those physiological responses. Okay. We are going to skip this third one and go to this last one right here. So if Avi is crying and not speaking, what active listening skills could you use to respond to Avi? And so I'm going to launch the next poll. Again, so if Avi is crying and not speaking, what active listening skills could you use to respond to Avi? Could you use paraphrasing and making room for silence, building on past successes, validating and encouragement, clarifying, checking in, summarizing, mirroring, questioning, normalizing and prioritizing, opening and closing, grounding, addressing blame and shame, and addressing physiological responses. So we're going to end this one. And so a lot of you all recognize the making the room for silence, and the checking in, right, to see what's happening. Some folks also got the grounding, right? Like, is it time to do a grounding technique? Some breathing together. Yeah. So thank you all. All right. And so to wrap it all up together, survivors deserve our active and empathetic time, effort, and attention. And so survivors are worth it and they deserve these things from us. And that is everything that I have to share with you all today. I apologize for going over a little bit with our time, but if you have any questions, I will stay on. Thank you all so much. I truly appreciate it. If you have any questions, let me know. I'll be looking at them in the chat. And please register for our next part in our series about security. And I'll see you all soon. Thank you so much. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. But again, if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me.